What's up, skeptics? Welcome to another episode of Reason to Doubt, your source for all things skeptical. I'm Jordan. Jared is with me, and we are going to try something new for us, a new format. We're going to do book reviews, and today we are starting with David Fitzgerald's Jesus, Mything in Action, which I know I've said it before. I love that title. It's a great title.
It's probably one of the best titles for a book, or just a title for anything in that matter. It's like, It's really good.
So good. Anyway, we had David on the channel last November, and we had a great time. And so before we rake his book over the coals and tear it apart, we want to say that, one, we did enjoy talking to David. We think he's a good guy, and I fully believe he believes everything in the book, right? I disagree with a lot of what he has to say, but I don't think he's like being dishonest or anything. I just, think he's wrong. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation with David, and this is a skeptical channel. So as skeptics, we want to be skeptical of even claims from within our own camps. And so we shouldn't just accept everything whole cloth. And we're going to look at David's book and look at it from a skeptical lens and see if the claims hold up to the evidence. David does state out in his introduction, though, that the truth is arguments of the mythicist camp have never been rebutted. They've rarely even been debated. Instead, they've been sniffed at, mocked, declared to be mistaken, outdated, or simply irrelevant, and more often than not, simply ignored. So, David, we heard you. We are not going to sniff or mock at your claims here or the mythicist claims, and we're not going to ignore them. We are going to attempt to refute them.
Now, I can't promise that I'm going to make zero jokes, but
it would be in a lighthearted manner, not to the points, right?
So, like we said, we disagree with him, but you're going to see why.
So if you've been living under a rock, I don't mean that way. So mythicism is essentially the position that the figure, Jesus Christ, who's depicted in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, never existed as a historical person, that this was a mythological figure all along that was later historicized in stories to put him in context here on earth, so that the person never lived at all on earth. They were a myth, and then later people told stories about this person as if he did live on earth. So. Right.
The exact specifics of what the timing of it, who told these stories, how it came about, those vary from mythicist to mythicist. So it's not a perfectly homogenous group.
No.
But yeah, the basic thrust is that there was never a person, Jesus of Nazareth. And another thing to point out is it is not the case that there is a mythicist, like Jesus never existed, or Jesus was the divine miracle working son of God. Like, those are not the only two options. The actual other option to mythicism that isn't Christian triumphalism is the historicist position, which is that there was a person, probably named Jesus, who lived in the first century, and that's who these stories are based on. Now, who that person was, what character they had, that is a thing that varies by by historians, so there's multiple ideas of that. But basically, you've got mythicism, there was no dude. Historicism, there was a dude.
And stuff in between.
And David's book is arguing for the former. There was no dude. We're also still kind of feeling out the format for these book reviews. So the big way it's basically going to go is we're not planning on going slavishly chapter by chapter. We're going to more or less go through them. This one has 3 volumes, but we're going to go more or less in order and kind of pick out the main themes that we think should be addressed. So let us know in the comments if you want us to mix it up or if there's something you think we should dive in more, whatever. But today's theme is, why aren't historians mythicists? That's the very first question that David poses in his book. And he's essentially asking, if his hypothesis is correct, why do so many experts disagree with him?
Yep. This is something that Jordan asked himself early on in his deconversion process with young earth creationism. And it's what led him basically to become an atheist. So,
absolutely. And it's a great question. It's very important to know where the scholarly consensus is on any topic, which even David in the book says. He says it's certainly reasonable for lay people to appeal to the consensus, and in most cases, the consensus is a very fine thing built upon a good, solid foundation. So it's true that something being the scholarly consensus doesn't make it true, right? Scholars can be wrong. However, experts are usually right. right? That's why they're experts. That's why when you have a problem, a health problem, you go to your doctor, not your plumber, because he's an expert and he's probably, or they're an expert and probably right. So it's important to understand where most of the experts are, because like a priori, all else being equal, they're probably correct, right?
So this particular book is looking at the experts of this particular field, right?
Right. So why aren't more historians convinced that Jesus was mythical, like David is? To hear mythicism proponents like Richard Carrier or David or Guy West Engineer tell it, they think that the evidence is clear, it's obvious, and it's overwhelming, right? So if it is so obvious, why aren't experts persuaded? And so David, I think, rightly recognizes this is something he has to deal with right up front. Right? This is the first thing he has to address, because he knows that he and Carrier and the rest are on the fringe. They're on the very edge of scholarship on this topic. There's very few people who are experts in the field who agree with them. Right.
The answer that he essentially gives is that all biblical scholars are theologically biased, right?
Right. All of them, especially the atheist ones. He says, quote, "Biblical history has always been an apologetic undertaking in the service of Christianity. So the primary reason why no historian is convinced is because they have religiously motivated bias." And so he dedicates the first and second and actually some other chapters too, on undermining the entire field of biblical scholarship and showing why you shouldn't rely on their conclusions, why you shouldn't trust them. And this isn't us like projecting onto Fitzgerald. He's very explicit. Here's another quote. "We all have our biases, of course. That's no crime. The problem is that in this case, the particular bias is a deal killer. Ask yourself, how many Christians do you suppose are open to entertaining the idea that the Lord and Savior they depend on for their salvation, not to mention their salaries, might never have existed?" End quote.
Well, I mean, I could think of a few offhand. Progressive Christianity has taken this to the extreme in some cases, but you have examples like Marcus Borg, who doesn't even believe that Jesus was a divine being. The resurrection is called into question for him. So it's not that far off to think that, if you just say, well, he wasn't even a guy, Marcus Borg could still have his Christianity without Jesus being a dude.
Marcus Borg considers himself a Christian, and he has said, quote, that he believes in the resurrection of Jesus. And this is a quote from him: "I'm just skeptical that involved anything to do with his corpse." That's pretty far outside the mainstream.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, but to his statement, he makes it seem that no Christian would ever even entertain the idea of Jesus not being a historical person. And I think we have evidence to the contrary, and there's very progressive Christianities out there. So,
right. But
maybe
I
not
think
fundamentalists, though. Yeah.
It is fair to say that there are Christians who certainly wouldn't. Right.
No, exactly.
And mythicists sometimes get accused of being like the young earth creationists of atheism, basically. And David tries to address this by, he tries to draw a distinction between history, particularly biblical history, and science. And he says something that science would never do is start out with a predetermined conclusion and then demand that all scientists must swear allegiance to that idea regardless of what evidence became uncovered in the future. Which, okay, that's true. It's something that scientists probably wouldn't do. But in the next sentence, he says, though, "And yet, look what we find throughout Christian academia. The majority of biblical historians are Christian believers." And you see the subtle switch there? Those aren't the same thing, right?
Yeah, see, he went from swearing allegiance to a thing and then stating just being Christian, right? So there's...
Right. Two different things going on there, right? The implication, of course, is that someone being Christian means they cannot do good history, at least where Jesus is concerned, right? Now, he has some things that he thinks support this, some data that he has that he thinks support that this is the case, or at least that we should suspect it's the case. He believes that, quote, "Increasingly, biblical studies departments, academic positions, and degrees are only to be found being offered by religious institutions, and a considerable number, if not the majority, of religious institutions require a confession of faith from their scholars."
Yeah. So this goes into, if you want to work for us, you have to sign a statement of faith that says you believe X, Y, and Z exactly as we do.
Right. And critically, you agree that nothing you research, none of your published works or anything will go outside of those four walls.
Contradict those things. Yes, exactly.
Right. And so this is a true thing. It is a thing that happens in some universities, and it is obviously a bad thing. We fully agree with David Fitzgerald that this is not a good way to conduct scholarship. Obviously, it's not good for what's the term I'm looking for? Independence of thought. There's a better term for that. It doesn't matter. Whatever. It's not good for scholarship if you decide ahead of time what conclusion you're going to arrive at, right?
Yeah, I would say this isn't even scholarship at this point.
Yeah.
So.
In fact, I would go so far as to say that if someone is publishing who is working in a department where they cannot come to a different conclusion, like contractually, than the one that they came with, then yeah, I would probably not consider that scholarship. At that point, it's just basically propaganda, right? Yeah. But the question is, how common is this, right? Because it's a huge difference whether it's like 90% or 9%, you know? So David had a team of volunteers do a survey of the degree granting institutions in America. Now, it would have been better, as David acknowledges, to do a survey of like the people working in the field, but I guess he believed that was too difficult. So we went with the degree granting institutions. So I'm just going to go down. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can imagine that'd be a pretty big undertaking, actually.
Yeah,
so,
I can think of some ways you could do it and make it narrowed down. But anyway, we'll get into that in a second. Yeah. So here's how the results of this survey that David says shows that that the majority of people working in the field can't be trusted because they are bound by these statements of faith or whatever. Here's how the results are presented in the book. 4,726 degree granting institutions are in the U.S. Of that, 1,417 have relevant biblical/Jesus/New Testament studies. Of the 1,417, 814 were religiously affiliated. The remaining 603 were not religiously affiliated. Of the religiously affiliated, 273 were required their employees to sign or verbally affirm a statement of faith. The remaining 2/3 of 544 schools did not respond to the survey or did not have a statement of faith. 197 had no response. 344 said no statement was required. Did you catch all that?
That's clear as mud. I totally understand it. Actually, when I was reading the book, I've read this book 3 times, by the way, so far. So don't say in the comments that we haven't even read his book. We have.
You are a liar. You've never opened this book once in your life.
I had to stop in this. And so what Jordan just recapped is done over like several pages in the book. And so like the numbers just started bouncing around in my head, and through all of it, I was trying to like imagine like, what does that even mean? Like,
now,
you know,
to be fair, there are 2 charts that attempt to express these. One of them is like, it's a 3D pie chart, a 3D, not just a pie chart, a 3D pie chart. Come on. There's so many other visualizations. So it's fine. It's fine. And
it only shows the religiously affiliated and non-affiliated, right, as you can see.
So what I did, I took the numbers Jared put together and I put them on a chart all together. You can see it there. So this is the actual situation. Okay. You've got, of the 4,700 some odd institutions in the US, he says 3,309 of them don't have a relevant program. 603 of them are not religiously affiliated. 541 are religiously affiliated. And a further 273 are religiously affiliated and have a statement of faith.
Wow. So when you actually look at it like this, so that's a lot easier to digest. And I can visually see where that breakdown is.
Right. So just to get some percentages, that means of all institutions that were looked at, 6% were in the religious with a statement of faith, which is the segment that we're supposed to be most concerned about, right? If you just focus on the ones with relevant degrees, then that is 20%. But what does that mean to have a relevant degree?
Yeah, that was the question that popped into my mind when I was reading this. I was like, wait, relevant degree. Like, I need more than that, David. I want to know exactly what was your criteria for determining what constituted a relevant degree. Does it mean it has to be from a biblical like institution? Could it be just a generic, Old Testament survey course? Like, what is it, right?
So figure one, the other figure that he posted, the title, it's titled U.S. Learning Institutions with Biblical Studies Departments. Well, which is it, though? Is it a biblical studies department or is it a relevant degree? Because those aren't necessarily the same thing, right?
They're not.
So, for example, just to show, you could have a degree like an ancient history. That's not a biblical studies degree. But presumably, David would think that is a relevant degree because that's a degree that Richard Carrier has. He has a PhD in ancient history, focusing on the early Roman Empire. And if somehow you don't know who Richard Carrier is, I don't know how you got here. But anyway, Richard Carrier is like the big name in mythicism, and he is cited all up and down this book. David obviously highly respects Richard Carrier's scholarship on this topic, right? So he clearly thinks that Richard Carrier is qualified to speak on this topic, and yet Richard Carrier would not count as having a degree that's relevant according to the survey.
Yeah,
Presumably.
yeah.
I did email David to like try to get some of the methodology, but it was like yesterday I'm not surprised he hasn't gotten back to me because, like, why should he, right? So if he does, we'll correct and some of this is incorrect, then we'll correct it when he gets back to me. But we're like judging the book based on what's in the book, right? So according to what's in the book, it doesn't seem like Richard Carrier would count as having a relevant degree, but David clearly does. Also, America isn't the only place where scholarship happens,
right? In fact, scholarship happens all over the world. And in a lot of cases, some of the most concentrated areas of biblical studies happen in Europe, like in places like Germany, where when I was going through my undergrad in my master's program, like I didn't have access to some things because I couldn't read German. Some of the papers that I needed to read to get stuff, I had to find somebody else to help me translate them because I didn't have access to them. So like it just goes to show you that the U.S. is just a small sample size. So like that graph should even go.
So 70% of universities in America have no program that's relevant to the New Testament, apparently, but I don't think that's correct. But okay, let's keep moving on. Let's keep digging down. He splits the ones with relevant programs. He splits them between religiously affiliated and not religiously affiliated. And the clear implication is that those who are religiously affiliated are the ones that we should be suspecting of bias. Right. Mm-hmm. But what counts as being religiously affiliated? I mean, at the face of it, it seems like it should be obvious. Oh, they're like a Christian school. That seems to be that's the image I would have, I kind of first.
So if you were to poll the audience, probably the first answer anybody's going to give you is like Liberty University. Like that would be number one on anybody's mind, right? Clearly a religiously affiliated university. Yeah.
And that is explicitly a Christian school. Like that is definitely religiously affiliated, right? For sure. And it's religiously affiliated in the relevant way and the manner in which David's like talking about it. Like that is clearly counts. But say, what about Duke University? They are historically affiliated with a Methodist church. Their motto is Eruditatio et Religio, which translates to knowledge and religion. And it was like historically, it was called Trinity College back in the day. So like it has a historical tie to the Methodist church. But like today, it's a non-sectarian church. You can go and get a degree in, I don't know, engineering or biology and like have absolutely nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever, you know?
So you don't need Yeah, would that fall under the religiously affiliated or not religiously affiliated? And I mean, we don't know based on the information we're provided.
We don't know, but I suspect it would if you just Google Duke. I Googled Duke religiously affiliated, and I said, yes, Duke is religiously affiliated with the Methodist Church. So I suspect, don't know, but I suspect that Duke would count under this. But if this is what counts as a religiously affiliated school, well, then that kind of loses some of its force, right? Now, it is true that Duke has a divinity school, and that is explicitly Christian, but the degrees they offer there are like theology degrees, which you could do biblical studies, biblical history with a theology degree, but you don't necessarily need a theology degree to do it, right? You could go to the Duke history department, which has nothing to do with the divinity school. And there you go. So, hey there, Future Jordan here. David Fitzgerald was kind enough to respond to my email asking about our methodology. He just responded, after we'd already recorded before. So regarding what degrees were included in the survey, he said that the team had a, quote, very conservative focus, and that his team kept their parameters specific on the degrees, biblical history, New Testament studies, Jesus studies, etc., as opposed to, say, history or ancient history, things like that. for the religious affiliation of schools, he said that, quote, if the religious affiliation wasn't obvious, we treated them as non-affiliated. This could still cover a wide variety of schools. Like Duke is officially affiliated with the Methodist Church, but it's functionally non-sectarian. David didn't confirm whether or not Duke was specific, like was included. That's just an example. But anyway, now you have the methodology straight from the horse's mouth. So back to past Jordan and Jared. But the next step, this is the one that is actually seems important. The next step is the 273 schools that require a statement of faith. And again, in the book, he says that this 273, they require a statement of faith or some kind of like a doctrinal commitment from the people that has to be signed or verbally assented to or whatever. That's what he says this is, right? This is also a little suspect because further on, after they kind of go through that breakdown, they say that some of the groups that said that they didn't require any statement of faith from their instructors and employees, he says that this is flatly untrue because, quote, further investigation showed that their statement of faith and or doctrinal requirements could be located on the school website.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, 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 whoa.
Pump the brakes, David.
Yeah.
Those two things are not the same thing. Yeah. You know?
A doctrinal requirement is what this statement of faith usually means. Like, I am signing a statement. I'm saying verbally or written that I will do this. But having a statement of faith on a website for a school is not unusual because that's just saying that the school, this is our belief system. This is what we believe as an institution. That doesn't mean that you have to sign that or agree with that to work at that institution, though.
Right. And it may be, even if it's not like signed, maybe there's like social pressure to force you to conform.
Sure.
Perhaps, or perhaps not. I don't know. And there's nothing in this data to tell me which it is. And so but not only does this like cast doubt on the entire survey, because if they're just saying, oh, well, they have a statement of faith, well, that's very different than forcing people to sign it, right? So now I'm questioning the entire 273 number. But aside from that, David says, okay, so there was like, I forget the numbers, like 30 or something schools. He says they lied. He I don't know if he uses the word lied actually, but he basically says that they said a flatly untrue statement is what he says. Mm-hmm. And so, which otherwise known as lying. So he's from that, he concludes that the actual number of schools that have this doctrinal requirement could be as high as all of them. Bum, bum, bum.
So this part really struck me because not only is it the last thing that he leaves his reader in that section, so he goes through all this data, but the very last thing he wants to leave you with is it could be as high as all of them. To me, that I don't want to say it, but it sounds like you're poisoning the well here, David. They're like, you want the reader to leave this saying all of these things have to be called into question. That's a stretch.
Which is just not what the data says. It goes well beyond what even the most charitable reading of this survey could be. Even if that 273 group is, in fact, a number of schools that all of them strictly enforce the statement of faith, right? And even if you are correct that the 70% of universities in America have no degree program that is in any way relevant to studying the New Testament as a historian, if we accepted all of that, it would still be the case that 80% of schools don't require a statement of faith. That's what your data actually says. And so, like, yes, it could be all of them. Well, sure. Like, if I did a survey and like I studied and I found, I don't know, 5% of Americans are in the KKK, but then I went back and like did some sleuthing and I found, oh, another 2% I was able to confirm they lied about it. They were actually in the KKK. So it could be all of them. I mean, it could, but that doesn't mean it is. Like, that's not a reasonable inference from the evidence. So
right. Yeah, this is just a bald assertion. There's nothing backing it up. And that's what we want to hit home here. Like, so skeptically looking at the data, like it's on its face, it seems, wow, this is crazy. But when you actually look at it, you break it down and analyze it and ask yourself, what questions are being asked? What is the criteria? You know, what does the data actually show? I think it's speaks for itself.
Yeah,
so.
you have to dig past the narrative about the data and actually look at the data itself and let the data speak to you. Yeah. So now, just to be clear, we're not saying that the majority of biblical historians are not Christian. I mean, the majority of people are Christian in America, at least. Yeah. So like, just from that, I'd expect most people. And I mean, sure, it's a study of the Bible. I'd expect Christians to be attracted to that at a higher rate than most people, right? So I'm not saying that David is wrong in inferring that the majority of biblical scholars are Christians. I'm sure that's correct. What I am saying, the evidence he presents is insufficient to say that they work for institutions that hold them to a strict statement of faith or doctrinal requirements such that it limits their academic freedom. That's the word I couldn't remember earlier. Academic freedom.
Academic freedom. Freedom. Yeah.
Right. It may be the case, but the data presented by David does not show that.
It's also important to point out here too, and we mentioned it earlier, but this data is only speaking of the U.S., but when David talks about it, he doesn't qualify that when he says could be all of them. So like in my mind, I at that point, I have the picture all institutions, which is not represented. So.
And again, this is David Fitzgerald wants us to take this and therefore conclude like this is why there's so much resistance among scholars to the Jesus myth theory because of this religious control of the field. Okay. But okay, that's a survey, not the greatest survey in the world. I probably, if I was doing a multi-year survey, I would have, I don't know, done like a 20-year literature review and just looked at all the papers being published and like seeing where they were being published. Because like, even if 20% of schools are religious, maybe those 20% are like super prolific. And so like 90% of papers are published by this 20% with the statements of faith. Well, that's a very different picture. Or maybe they're not prolific at all. And it's like 1% of papers. Well, that's different too. But okay, let's leave. I'm going to take off my analyst hat for a second. Let's leave that aside. There's another piece of data that David gives. After this more quantitative data, he gives a sample of qualitative data, some anecdotes about people being persecuted. So biblical scholars who said things that were contrary to Christian dogma. And as a result, had bad things happen to them. And so these examples are intended to undergird the survey results and show us that it is, in fact, the entire field that's corrupt.
So the majority of this actually takes place in chapter 2 of the book. And this is where he goes over these cases. Now, we're not going to go over all of the cases. He presents 6 cases. I think we don't have the time to go over them with a fine-tooth comb. But what we can do is actually look at a few of them and kind of see what these cases look like, what the outcomes were, how David presents them, right? So the first case is actually probably the most famous case. If you have spent any time on atheist or Christian YouTube, you're going to hear about this. But the Licona zombie apocalypse in Matthew case, right?
Yeah, this is where Licona, who, if you're unaware, is a Christian apologist and biblical scholar who has said that he doesn't think that the pericope, is that how you pronounce it? Pericope? In Matthew. Yeah. Pericope, whatever. Pericope. He doesn't think the story in Matthew where like the saints get up and walk around, he thinks that's like an analogy or like it's apocalyptic imagery meant to undergird or emphasize how important a thing is going on. He thinks it was a metaphor, right?
Yeah, just
and he
metaphor.
and he got some flack for it. And I think we've mentioned early on the thing. I actually respect Licona a lot. I disagree with many of his conclusions, but Licona seems like a person who is honestly trying to get to the truth. I don't think he's gotten there, but like this is the guy who has at some points in his history said, what's my confidence that Jesus rose from the dead? Like 80%. 80%. Like that's way lower than I expected.
Yeah. Maybe 99%, which you hear from most Christians. But so David kind of outlines what happened, like talks about the Matthew thing. And then he goes in to show how, some apologists accuse Micah of denying full inerrancy. He talks about how he lost speaking gigs as a result of it. And it ended up resulting in him choosing of his own volition to resign his positions from the Southern Evangelical Seminary where he was working, as also his positions on the board of the North American Mission Board, where he had been doing some apologetic consulting, basically. So he does go on, to David's credit, to suggest that some prominent Christian scholars unsuccessfully came to Licona's defense, and that a good number were afraid to actually do so because of punitive measures. So again, this is kind of like, they know it, they can't speak out because they'll get smacked on the wrist, basically. So
okay, but let's look at what actually happened. So Mike did resign his position. He lost some bucks because he lost some speaking positions. But where is he now? Well, Mike Licona is currently the associate professor in theology at Houston Baptist University, as well as a professor in theology at Northwest University, and he's a director of like a ministry. So it's not like he was running out of town on the rails. He's at a Baptist seminary. Like, he didn't even need to go to an ivory tower of liberalism to get a new job. You know, he didn't even need to leave like evangelical scholarship, basically. But
David presents this like he ends the case like Mike lost his job. That's it. He doesn't go on to say the other part of it because that would undergird his case, right?
And also, you know who didn't grab pitchforks and torches to go like crucify Mike Licona? Biblical scholars, right? This story is supposed to be showing us why the field of biblical scholarship is so biased that they won't tolerate any heresy. And yet the only biblical scholars mentioned are the ones who are defending Mike Licona.
Yeah. Or the ones who wanted to defend it, but were a little afraid. Right. Yeah.
Okay. So what this actually shows is that evangelical organizations won't tolerate you stepping too far out of line, which I could have told you that. Like, sure. I'm not at all surprised that Mike Licona said something that was outside of the like very right-wing fundamentalist interpretation of scripture. And as a result, fundamentalist Christians didn't want him around. Okay, cool. I agree. But that doesn't mean that the entire field of biblical scholarship is corrupt.
Well, that's case one. Let's look at case number 6. So this is Anthony Ledonne, either Ledonne or Ledonne. I don't know how to pronounce words sometimes. So we'll just go with Anthony. David Fitzgerald starts out by saying that Anthony was a young and up-and-coming evangelical New Testament scholar until his book, Historical Jesus, What Can We Know and How Can We Know It? This came out in 2011. So apparently this lost him his job because how? Well, David even states in the book that he's not really sure how this lost him his job, but goes on to say that there was some donors who weren't happy, and so he ended up being forced to lose his job, right? But what he does state in the book is that his book was well received. Wait for it. By biblical scholars. So the book that got him in hot water was received well by biblical scholars.
Those are supposed to be the people that are like all corrupt and in the pocket of the Pope and stuff. Like, those guys thought it was great. What?
Exactly. So the reason he lost his job is because some donors were mad about what he said in the book, and then the president or whoever was running the university fired him. So
what did other like universities have to say about this?
So, well, surprisingly enough, Anthony actually, so a lot of scholars, well, let's hold on here. David says, and this is a quote from the book, scholars were swift to express their support for Ledonne and their indignation over his treatment. University of Edinburgh's Larry Hurtado pulled no punches when he called the incident shameful and cowardly, and openly asked why some Christians institutions treated their academic staff in manner so harsh, so paranoid, and so unchristian. And not just in Ledonne's case, but across the field of biblical scholarship.
So a Christian organization got irritated, fired him, and the field of biblical scholarship condemned it.
Yes. The same field that is supposed to be, holding these people down, right? It's kind of interesting. I think it's important to point out too, in the book, David clearly states that Anthony was a young and up-and-coming scholar until this book came out. And then he ends. He doesn't say anything else about Anthony's future. So the picture he's painting is that Anthony ended up getting fired and that was it. And he never worked in another religious institution ever again.
He's like bussing tables at a Denny's.
But that's not the case. He's actually working at the United Theological Seminary as a professor in New Testament studies. So
he's still working in the field.
He's still working in the field. I don't want to say that David didn't do this, but in all 6 cases, he doesn't. So maybe Tom Thompson, he actually goes into like saying Tom Thompson eventually got a job, but only after the consensus started to agree with the things that he said, right?
Well, hang on. I thought the consensus couldn't change. I thought that was the whole point of this exercise.
That little guy, I wouldn't worry about that little guy. So. But yeah, so this is the point, right? He doesn't, to me, it seems a little strange that David wouldn't point out that all of these people ended up getting positions within the field, within other Christian institutions. So yes, they did step out of line. But here's the other thing that I think undermines this. They all stepped out of line. They weren't afraid to speak up. They weren't afraid to publish. They weren't afraid to get out there and say things that went against the consensus. Like, isn't that what this whole thing is supposed to be stopping them from doing? And like, these are only 6 cases, right? This is all, but it's all anecdotal evidence in the end.
Presumably these are the best 6 that David knew, because otherwise why would you put them in your book?
Yeah, you put your best case forward, right? So.
Right. So if this is the best 6 cases that are supposed to prove to me that biblical scholarship is a field so thoroughly under the boot of fundamentalist Christians that nobody can step out of line because they'll lose their career, this is not that. This does show that for some institutions, the Christian sensibilities have too much influence. I think that's fair. There are certainly some institutions where that is the case. But David does not, in his book, show that is systematic for the entire field. It doesn't show that we should therefore we should reject the findings of the entire field as biased, which is the thing that David is explicitly saying he's trying to prove. Moreover, something that we haven't talked about yet, but like, okay, maybe you'd believe that like Christian scholars are bound by statements of faith or whatever, they're reluctant. What about the ones that aren't Christian? What about them?
What about them, Jordan? Well, they're all tainted too because they work in the same field. So that you just need to know that. Got
it. So all of the scholars are bound by religious convictions, especially the atheist ones.
Yeah.
He states in chapter 1, arguably it's gotten to the point where now secular biblical historians are the only ones who are actually making any real progress in the field at all. Yet even among secular biblical scholars, it's difficult to find one who doesn't come out of a religious background. Theological assumptions are a pervasive difficulty in the field, not merely among practicing believers, but among the formerly religious as well. So, of course, mythicism is a minority opinion. I fully expect mythicists like me will remain on the scholarly periphery for as long as biblical studies continue. So basically, if you were, not only are you a Christian, but if you ever were a Christian or presumably were raised Christian, you are forever tainted. You have that original sin of Christianity, and therefore you cannot be trusted.
Yeah. Well, I think this kind of like pokes a little bit at, the Bart Ehrmans of the world.
I'm pretty sure that entire thing was geared directly at Bart Ehrman.
He does mention Bart Ehrman in some other places in the book, but I don't think he specifically mentions him at this section, but it is important to note. So even if you're committed atheist now, it doesn't matter. Your pro-Christian biases are a part of you. You can't take that away. But let's kind of summarize this whole little section here. So yes, some bad things happen at religious institutions to scholars. That's bad. Okay, totally agree.
We flatly and unequivocally condemn that. That is bad. It has a chilling effect on the field. Even if it doesn't ruin the entire field, it is not a good thing, and it shouldn't happen.
Not at all. But what the case that David's presented is all anecdotal evidence and may or may not be indicative of the entire field of biblical studies, right? We don't know. Since we don't have the evidence, it hasn't been provided to us in a way that we can make a determination, right? The picture that David's painting in this section of his book is that everyone is afraid to speak out and support the Jesus myth theory, including secular scholars, as we've seen. So this kind of gets to my favorite little part of here. And I call this little section Carrier's Girlfriend in Canada. So in a section here, David notes that Richard Carrier has found lots of agnostics and major historians in the field who have told him personally and privately that
him
quote,
being Carrier
told Carrier. So Carrier told David what they told him, but he won't tell them. So this is what they told Carrier, quote, they do not touch this topic with a 10-foot pole, precisely because they fear the kind of they fear the kind of thing Ehrman is doing and threatening. They do not want to lose their jobs or careers, prospects, and opportunities. They do not want to be ridiculed or marginalized. But as they don't feel safe coming forward with these views publicly, he has continued to protect their anonymity. So, Jordan, you should see my girlfriend. She's super fine. Yeah,
awesome. You should bring her around.
Well, I think she lives in Canada, so but maybe, you know, like
the scheduling wouldn't work, and you know, but trust me, so hot.
How convenient is it that all of these prominent, especially very prominent historians in the field,
huge historians, the best historians, huge.
I find so. I don't think that mythicists are conspiracy theorists at all. But this is the kind of language that you hear from conspiracy theorists, right? Like
every conspiracy theorist, every single one is convinced there's both simultaneously a cabal, like all working against them, and at the same time somehow like a silent majority of people who are afraid to speak out. Like, so I don't think they believe the shadowy cabal part, but it like you said, this sounds like the sort of thing we hear from conspiracy theorists. Oh, the experts really agree with me. They're afraid to speak out, and I don't want to say their names, but trust me, they're there. Well, I'm sorry. I don't believe you. Like, I'm going to need some evidence. I'm going to need some names. I'm going to need something other than source, trust me, bro, to believe that there's actually this huge movement in the field. I don't want to say that I don't think David's lying. I think this is his impression, but I don't think his impression is based on good evidence. I don't think that this impression is that there's sufficient evidence to draw this conclusion.
No. So let's kind of wrap up the first couple chapters here. What do we make of these first few chapters?
So one thing we should take from this is that David recognizes that this position, mythicism, is not accepted by the most scholars. He is well outside of the scholarly consensus, and that's something he feels compelled to address. And the thing that he thinks explains it is not that the evidence is poor or that the arguments are weak or anything like that. No, the reason nobody agrees with him, not nobody, but very few people agree with him, is because all of them are biased. Every single person in the field outside of Carrier and Price and himself and, you know, a few select others, the reason they don't agree, outside of the handful of mythicists, the reason they don't agree is either they refuse to agree because of their religious convictions blinding them to the truth, or the crushing strength of the Christian church is forcing them into silence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, there's a couple positives here. One, David is asking questions. Why don't people believe the way that I believe? Let's look into that. Great question to ask. So I think we need to do that. Yeah. He is pointing out there is some hypocrisy within the field. He is pointing out there are some institutions who, yes, they do have bad practices. They require their staff to sign a statement of faith. Yes, some scholars get in trouble when they speak out against it. These are all great things to point out, and we should point them out, and we should call these institutions out for doing so, right?
That's a great point. We should be aware that this is a thing that happens in this field. And so you have to know when you're reading something, who is it that's publishing this? Are they someone that's publishing from Liberty University and are contractually obligated to come to this conclusion? Or are they someone publishing at a secular university where they're free to make whatever decision they want? That is absolutely a valuable question you should ask, for sure.
Yes. Have we been presented enough evidence to conclude that the entire field of biblical studies is tainted and can't be trusted because they are religious, though?
No, absolutely.
We have not. No. So I think that's it for this first couple of chapters. Anything else you kind of wanted to add or say just in general?
No, as we go through, what matters ultimately is the evidence. So it ultimately doesn't matter whether or not the majority of scholars are convinced, because the evidence is what matters. The reason it's a relevant question for skeptics to ask is because we are not experts, right? And so it's important as lay people to listen. You should get your history from historians. It's the bottom line. You should get your biology from biologists. You should get your physics from physicists. You should get your history from historians.
I think one last thing I want to iterate is that the entire 3 volumes of this book are based on the foundation that biblical scholarship is tainted, right? So most of the arguments that he is going to make moving forward are based on the assumption that biblical scholarship is tainted. It has this bias, and that we need to keep that in mind when we're starting to look at the claims and evaluations of scholarship in the coming chapters, right?
So that's the first episode of, I have no idea how many episodes this is going to be. The thing is 3 volumes. We'll keep going as long as you're interested. We're not going to do this every single week. We're going to do it probably about once a month until we get exhausted and give up or get to the end of the book.
Yeah. And I do want to point out too, we're not setting out to just destroy David Fitzgerald's book. I thoroughly enjoy David as a person. He brings a lot to the table for educating atheists and Christians alike on some of the very bad things of Christianity. So I think that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
The one thing. Yeah.
In future episodes, I know there's going to be more I agree with David than in this one. This one's
for sure.
pretty much negative, but yeah.
The one last thing I wanted to point out, though, so in the introduction to David's book, he states, every word of what little evidence we do have is complete hearsay. In relating to the mythicist position, this is a claim, pretty big claim.
Very big claim. That's bold.
I hope he can support this in the remainder of the book. So that's all I wanted to say.
So now that we've reached the end of our review, as always, we have a fallacy for you. Today's fallacy of the day is cherry picking.
Cherry picking. So if you are not familiar with cherry picking, I don't know how you made it this far in the video, first of all, and how you ended up here. But cherry picking is basically going out and looking for pieces of evidence that support your position. And you're also ignoring evidence that don't support your position. That's important too. So
you've got this field of stuff and you pick the cherries that you like and leave the rest, right?
You don't want the bad cherries.
You don't want the bad cherries. You don't want those bananas or whatever. So this happens I cannot tell you how many times I have had someone cite a paper. I asked them for their evidence and they cite a paper, and you go to the paper and they read the first sentence of the abstract and literally nothing else. Or they went in and found one statistic they liked and they quoted that, but didn't quote any of the context, which undermined it. That's cherry picking.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not good. It's not a good practice at all.
Right. So if you exclude all evidence that disagrees with you, then all of the evidence is going to agree with you, right? That's not a good way to get to truth. Sometimes, even if you're right, even if you're correct, there's likely going to be evidence that points in the other direction, because reality isn't clean cut, and usually the way things really are is not quite so black and white, right? And so you shouldn't be afraid of it, one, because you shouldn't be afraid of the truth anyway. You want to just follow the evidence where it leads, not lead the evidence where you want. But also, you should be aware of the evidence that points against you, not because it means you're wrong, but to give yourself an accurate picture of what reality looks like.
Yep.
So
simple
that's our
today.
Yep, very simple. So that's our episode. Again, this is a new format for us, so let us know what you think in the comments. If you have some things you want us to cover or points you want us to hit, make sure to let us know, and we'll try to hit them in future episodes. I'm going to make a prediction. Go ahead.
Before your prediction, I will add, if you're listening to this, you should go out, you should buy David Fitzgerald's book, read it for yourself, and make sure that we are accurately depicting it, right? And if we're not, let us know. So.
Yeah, definitely let us know if we got something wrong. I'm going to make a prediction that this video will be responded to by a Mythicist channel. That Mythicist channel will conclude that we are lying about having read the book. We didn't read the book. If we did read it, we didn't understand it. And if we did understand it, we have an agenda. I'm making that prediction right now.
Put in the comments below which channel you think that is.
Right. Anyway, that's our show. And remember, till next time, you've always got reason to doubt.
Peace out.